Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're doing something really cool. We are going to pop the hood on literary language to figure out exactly why certain writing just absolutely captivates us. We're going to explore the hidden mechanics, the invisible machine that authors use to grab our attention and literally refuse to let go.
So I want you to think about this brilliant analogy from stylistics researchers Leach and Short. Why is it that you process a bus timetable without even thinking about the words, but a poem forces you to slow down and notice every single syllable? I mean, both use the English language, right? Both convey information, but the actual experience of reading them is fundamentally opposed. Well, here is our roadmap for today to figure out why. We're going to cover 1. The magic of literary language, 2. Breaking rules with deviation, 3. Setting patterns with parallelism, 4. Creating and defeating expectations, and 5. When form becomes meaning. Let's dive right in.
Kicking things off with Section 1, the magic of literary language. To really get this, we have to borrow a foundational theory from the 1920s Prague linguistic circle. They argued that everyday language is what they call automaticized. Basically, it acts as an invisible, highly transparent vehicle for information. You read that bus timetable, you get the time, and you instantly forget the font and the phrasing. It's perfectly efficient. Literary language, on the other hand, de-automaticizes the act of reading. It actively strips away that habitual transparency so that how something is said becomes just as important as what is said. The language literally stops being a clear window and becomes a stained glass window. You're meant to look at it, not just through it.
And that brings us to the star of our show, foregrounding. This was defined by a theorist named Jan Mukarovsky, and foregrounding is essentially the deliberate disruption of linguistic norms. It's a disruption that forces you to stop and look at the language rather than seeing right through it. It takes words from the background of your mind and shoves them right to the front of your awareness. It's really the overarching engine of all literary style. Which leads us perfectly into Section 2, breaking rules with deviation. Let's see how foregrounding actually works in practice. Listen to this famous example from linguist Noam Chomsky. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. It's kind of wild, right? He created this sentence to prove a very specific point. The grammar here is absolutely flawless. You've got an adjective, a subject, a verb, and an adverb, all in the exact right places. But it violently breaks the rules of semantic compatibility. Ideas can't be green, they definitely can't be colorless and green simultaneously. They don't sleep, and you for sure can't sleep furiously. It deviates from conventional meaning, which instantly draws your attention directly to the language itself.
Now, what's super interesting here is that writers don't just break one rule at a time. They can strategically break rules on multiple levels all at once. So Chomsky's sentence was semantic deviation, playing with anomalies and metaphors. But writers also use syntactic deviation, like scrambling up the grammar or intentionally leaving words out, or even phonological deviation, where they break expected sound patterns or rhythm. Basically, an author is constantly choosing which level of your linguistic expectation they want to mess with.
Let's zoom in on a micro example of this. Take this line from the poet John Donne. She is all states and all princes, I, nothing else is. This is a textbook case of what we call local deviation. By suddenly equating a person to a massive political entity, literally saying she is all states. This isolated semantic anomaly creates a huge moment of intense foregrounding. Because it's just this single, highly unexpected element sitting against a background of normal language, it demands your immediate attention. You can't just gloss over it. The invisible machine of the language halts, and it forces you to decode this really powerful connection between the private world of lovers and the massive public world of geopolitics.
But hey, breaking rules isn't the only trick up a writer's sleeve. Moving to Section 3, setting patterns with parallelism. Sometimes you grab attention not by breaking the rules, but by intensely doubling down on them. Instead of departing from a norm, parallelism creates foregrounding by establishing a pattern that is so incredibly obvious, it draws attention to itself as a highly deliberate structural choice. Think of it as the projection of equivalence. When a writer puts two totally different things into identical grammatical boxes, they are actively forcing your brain to compare, contrast, or relate those specific elements.
You probably recognize this one. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. This iconic opening from Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities is an absolute masterclass in syntactic parallelism.
Let's quickly break down exactly why this structure is so magnetic. First, we have syntactic equivalence. Dickens uses identical grammatical skeletons. It was the blank of blank. Second, he injects massive semantic contrast into that skeleton, best versus worst, wisdom versus foolishness. And finally, that combination creates the rhetorical claim. Because Dickens gives the exact same structural weight to best and worst, the grammar itself is making the argument. It's arguing that these massive contradictory extremes exist equally and simultaneously. The form is literally doing the heavy lifting here.
Okay, moving right along to Section 4. Creating and defeating expectations. This is where things get really fascinating. So far, we've talked about external norms, the standard rules of English. But texts can actually create their very own temporary rulebooks. We call these internal norms. Unlike standard grammar rules, internal norms are built through repetition inside the text itself. The author is essentially training you, the reader, to expect a highly specific pattern just for this one piece of writing. A perfect example of this is this historic speech by Winston Churchill. Now, without taking any stance on the historical context itself, if we just look purely at the linguistic mechanics at play, we can see a brilliant use of an internal norm being used to build immense rhetorical pressure.
Look at how this unfolds. By repeating the exact same opening phrase, "we shall fight," 4 separate times, a really powerful internal expectation gets set up in the listener's mind. By the time he's saying it for the 4th time, your brain is entirely primed to hear, "we shall fight" a 5th time. So when the final clause suddenly shifts to, "we shall never surrender," you experience that break as a massive rhetorical event. Stylisticans actually call this defeated expectation. And here's the secret. That deviation is only so powerful because the pattern was so rigorously established right beforehand.
And that brings us to our 5th and final section, when form becomes meaning. Why does any of this actually matter to us as readers? Well, the most striking, unforgettable literary moments happen when multiple foregrounding mechanisms converge. They act as this unified, invisible machine to deliver a huge cognitive and aesthetic reward. When the sound of the words, the structure of the grammar, and the core meaning all point in the exact same direction, you get an overwhelming intensity that everyday automatized language just cannot replicate. It really all boils down to what we call the stylistic principle. If a writer breaks a rule and it serves absolutely no interpretive purpose, if it doesn't add to the message, it's honestly just a mistake. It's an error. But when that formal deviation is perfectly calibrated to enhance the meaning, when you literally have to untangle the grammar to truly feel the emotion of the sentence, that is when it becomes true literary art. Form isn't a substitute for meaning, it is a fundamental constituent of it. So I'll leave you with this final thought. The next time you sit down to read a book or even listen to a great speech, I challenge you to look past the story just for a minute. Try to spot the deliberate deviations. Find those parallelisms. Look for the invisible machine of foregrounding that is quietly driving your imagination behind the scenes. Because once you start seeing the strings the writer is pulling, the magic of language doesn't disappear. It actually becomes even more impressive. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep looking closely at the words around you.